All right, thanks for joining JMT Consulting today for our webinar over 9 ways to turbocharge your grant seeking with John Hicks. My name is Megan Mendiola and I'm a regional marketing coordinator here at JMT. I'll go ahead and say a few words of introduction here and then I'll introduce John to get us started. So this webinar is sponsored by JMT Consulting. We are an ERP and financial management solutions consulting firm. We have over 28 years of experience specializing in nonprofits. We partner with a wide variety of software partners to find the best solution for your nonprofit. So just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. If you have any questions during the webinar, please go ahead and submit them into the Q&A section and we will get those answered for you. We're going to go ahead and wait until the end of the webinar to answer all of our questions, but please go ahead and submit those as you think of them and we'll make sure that those get answered. Also, today's webinar recording and slides will be emailed to you within 24 hours following the conclusion of today's webinar. Now I wanted to introduce you all to John Hicks. John Hicks, Certified Fundraising Executive, is principal and founder of DLBHICKS LLC, a firm that provides virtual grant-seeking services to nonprofits. Over a consulting career of more than 30 years, John has worked with a diverse group of more than 100 charities, from grassroots to global. John is a member of the faculty of Columbia University's Nonprofit Management Program and is a featured speaker for Candid, formerly the Foundation Center. He has been awarded Stellar Speaker status by the Council for the Advancement and Support of Education and appears as a featured webinar and conference presenter for organizations such as the Chronicle of Philanthropy, the Association of Fundraising Professionals, the Nonprofit Alliance, and the Institute of Fundraising. He is a contributing author to After the Grant and the Nonprofit Handbook. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to John to get us started.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to spend some time talking about 9 ways to turbocharge your grant seeking. Just a couple of words about the topic, and then I'll talk a little bit about the presentation and how it's going to unfold. So 9 ways to turbocharge your grant seeking is missing one operative word, and that is the. So what I'm presenting here is not necessarily the 9 ways to turbocharge your grant seeking. It's a list of 9 ways. And so these are things I've observed clients doing over the years that seem to work extraordinarily well, and things we've tried to put into practice with the work that we do with nonprofit organizations. And so I hope the observations will be helpful in helping you expand and improve your grant seeking efforts and getting better results for your nonprofit. I have roughly, by my count, about 30 to 35 minutes worth of presentation because I wanted to make sure I left enough time for questions. And with that as a brief introduction, I thought let's just dive into it. So where I want to start is basically, why do we need to turbocharge to begin with? So, why are we even talking about this topic? Well, there's several reasons that I think nonprofits are really looking at growing grant support. One is clearly diversification. I think most of us know, or practically all of us know, that if we're going to build healthy fundraising operations, we have to have a lot of different streams of support. And certainly grants can be part of that. The thing we have to be mindful of is that when we talk about grants, and particularly from foundations, this is the one sector when it comes to private charitable giving where donors are actually required to give money away. So foundations are required to give out a 5% disbursement. Literally think of it as their net worth each year to charity through distributions. So the idea is that this is money that can be accessible to us. And so we can use this money to perhaps diversify our funding from maybe only relying on events or only relying on corporate support. Another reason that we need to think about turbocharging is that basically there's increased competition. So what does turbocharging do for us? The theme that's going to run through the presentation here is basically how do you position your nonprofit organization all the way from building visibility to how you present yourself in a grant proposal and how you build relationships with grant makers to make yourself stand out from the crowd. So coming at Grantseeking with the mindset that we want to build and increase is something that's pretty important. One thing I talk about with my students at Columbia, and I talk about with clients and colleagues, is that when we talk about getting more money, be it from an individual donor or the government, or change conversation. And so we're getting them to look at us a bit differently. We're giving them a different kind of opportunity. So that means thinking, how are we competitive? How do we stand out? Well, I mean, that's going to help us in terms of turbocharging. Opportunity. Sometimes our need or our opportunity to grow our fundraising is actually driven by opportunity. There might be something that's happening in our community or in the environment in which we're operating that could bring a lot more money to the table. And that can be either, there could be something really good happening, or there could be some challenges. Preview coming attractions, yep, I am going to talk a little bit today about the emerging coronavirus challenge. I mean, it's a new normal we're all living in, so I think we have to acknowledge it. But for some organizations, I mean, this does present certain kinds of opportunities. I mean, let's be mindful that as of last week, nearly $1 billion in foundation and corporate philanthropy had been earmarked towards coronavirus research and the development of vaccines. And that research can brush across a lot of different areas. So sometimes crisis can, in fact, create opportunity. For growth, I mean, sometimes we need to turbocharge and build out our foundation and corporate grants, and government grants for that matter too, because we are in growth mode, because we have an opportunity to help more people or to do more programming. So therefore, there's a need to go out and start changing conversations and getting different kinds of grants coming in the door. Certainly for stability, the more large grants we're able to begin to bring into our organization, and large can vary depending on the size of the charity, the more working capital you have, and the more large grants they come to your organization, excuse me, the more you're able to go and ask others for the same kind of support. So basically there's a leader-follower mentality that I observe among grant makers. So bringing certain kinds of grants to the table can change that conversation and how you're perceived, and perhaps even open the door for other opportunities for you. And finally, I have here urgency. And quite frankly, when I did this presentation for a group down in Florida, Jacksonville, Florida, 2 weeks ago, I had 5 points on this piece of paper, or on this slide. Now I've got 6, because clearly there is a lot of urgency right now. And we need to be thinking about foundation grants for, I think, a couple of reasons. I mean, number one, foundations are required to give money. And so if we see other sectors, if you will, of donors who might be struggling a bit, because let's face it, the world economy, from opening bell to opening bell, it's like a roller coaster. So there's a lot of ups and downs. There's a lot of uncertainty. Sometimes grants are a safe harbor. I was commenting to one of my colleagues earlier today, and this bears repeating, is that since foundations in particular give money away based on how much money they made in the market during the prior year, this means that for 2020, they're still looking at earnings in 2019, which were pretty good for us. And so the conventional wisdom is that foundation giving typically will trail a downturn, an economic downturn. So if you go into a recession, foundation giving will usually kind of stay pretty steady for about 12 to 18 months. And then once that period passes, maybe that giving begins to go down a bit. And when the economy recovers, it'll trail that recovery. But foundation grant seeking can be, I think, a pretty good almost like safe harbor move in a time like this. Yes, it's going to be competitive, but that's why we're all here. That's why we're talking about turbocharging, and how can we build competitive cases and get ourselves to really stand out in the crowd. So with all of that as an introduction, let's take a look at the 9 ideas I have here. And by the way, at the end of the presentation, I also want to share a few tools with you that you might find useful that can help you in maybe increasing your efforts, improving your efforts. So the first one that I'd like to talk about is basically inspiration and aspiration. And this is something we see in almost any bit of literature on raising money. You have to inspire the donor, and you have to give them something aspirational so that we're talking to them about giving us more money. And that's very true with foundations. Something we have to remind ourselves about is that if we're talking about trying to get in institutional giving, and this could be government money or foundation money or corporate money, it's still people on the other side who are making decisions. And that can be a board of directors, it can be a program officer, it can be staff, whoever opens your envelope and reviews your grant proposal. So giving them an inspiring story actually works extraordinarily well in getting foundations to look at you a bit differently. I've intentionally chosen this photograph on this slide because what you're looking at here is a group of high school sophomores, and they participate in a program called the Health Science Academy for one of our clients, the Arthur Ashe Institute for Urban Health. What you have here is a whole group of high school sophomores who are studying health sciences in the after school hours and during the summer. And these kids are really looking to go into health science, going to college and getting a degree and graduating. This program graduates 95% plus. So 95% of the young people you're looking at in this picture are going to get their high school diploma, and nearly all of them are going to go to college. So there you have a pretty simple, aspirational, and inspiring story. And I'm convinced that every nonprofit organization has one of these stories, at least one. You probably have more than one. So part of turbocharging, I just think it starts with what is going to turn the donor on, and what are you excited about, and where can you make a real lasting positive change in your community and for the people that you help. So that's aspirations, that's inspirational. That's going to help you, again, change the conversation. This next slide, I think, is incredibly, incredibly important, and it's incredibly important this morning. It was incredibly important yesterday, and it's going to be important tomorrow, which is find your relevance. One of the mitigating factors in having your grant proposal chosen to begin with is basically, is your work relevant? And relevance really comes at the intersection between the needs and opportunities in your community and basically what you do. And therefore, why are you relevant? Why now? And one of the things that we've been thinking about this week, and you probably have as well, is given the current environment, how is our mission and how is our work relevant? How do we make a positive difference for people in a time of uncertainty? So regardless of what you do, if you're in the education industry, let's say your charity works with education and youth development, the need for your organization to engage kids is doubly, triply important right now in a time of uncertainty and crisis. If you are providing direct services out in the community where you do business, it could be healthcare, it could be feeding, it could be, hunger relief programs. Trust me, at a time like this, your charity, your mission, your work is highly relevant. So one of the things is, when it comes to being competitive and in raising money from foundations and corporations, is being able to find that messaging and to determine what really makes us relevant here and now and at this time. So something I would just really encourage everybody on this call to do is going away from this conversation today and thinking about, if someone stopped you on the street and asked you, okay, new normal, we're being told all these different things about coronavirus, we're all worried about this in our communities, how can your charity help? Why is your charity making a difference? I mean, how would you answer that question? The answer may be easy. The answer may be something you have to really think through a bit. But I think every charity can find relevance. And you can tell I'm really pushing this point because I think it's going to be the important thing that helps you stand out, not only in your grant seeking, but probably the other fundraising that you're doing as well. A third way that you can turbocharge your grant seeking is to think about grants a little bit differently. A lot of us in the world of fundraising, we kind of feel that we're charged with going out raising money from foundations and corporations and the government, and they tell us they are bosses and boards say go write grant proposals. But I think we have to think about what are we taking out into the marketplace? I mean, what are the products that we're going to use that's going to engender the kind of support we need? So the way I always think about goal setting is I've given you a matrix here. So you can see that the top level of this, going by the terms on the left-hand side of the screen, you have like sustaining support for two areas, operating and program, and most of us know that. So if you're raising money just to sustain your operating, you're really covering your operating costs. And those dollars are very, very important. And if you're raising money to sustain your programs, it's really maintaining and keeping your programs at current levels. Now that money is incredibly important to raise. And building out a body of smaller, steady contributions to make this happen, I think is a really important part of doing portfolio building. And that's one of the approaches we're always using, which is there's one track of smaller foundation grants, but there has to be a track of larger grants where we're a bit more ambitious, and that means the investment level. So on the operating side, investment means going beyond just keeping the doors open and asking for money to invest in capital expenses like equipment or capacity like staff training. Asking for money on the program side for expansion and enhancement. How can you make your programs bigger or better? I would also maybe throw into this category if you're piloting new initiatives. So if we have literally a portfolio of different kinds of asks and cases, that is going to help us broaden the footprint, reach a wholly maybe new different set of grant makers than we're approaching right now. So again, I encourage you to go back to the budget, think through what are the different things we have, what are some of our core costs, but what are some of the things we aspire to do, and do we actually have proposals and cases for those aspirational things that we might be able to take to grant makers. Building a pipeline of requests. I mean, part of this is having the products and having the story and determining our relevance. But many of us know that getting money from foundations, corporations, the government, the world of grants is a numbers game. We know that we're going to have to reach out and we're going to have to ask more than one funder for the money that we need, because not everyone's going to say yes, even though we've got the greatest program in the world. And the tried and true approach is really a monthly sustained outreach. I mean, one of the things that I sometimes observe in nonprofits is that, I talk to someone about their grant seeking, and I find that it's been episodic, it's been periodic. It's like, oh, we look for RFPs, requests for proposals, and we respond to them. Organizations that are able to build a competitive grant seeking program do a couple of things. Obviously, you're looking for RFPs. You're looking for grant opportunities that are announced by foundations and corporations and the government, but you're also driving that bus as well. You're also identifying potential funders and putting proposals in front of them. Now, I realize that we are going to be limited by those foundations that accept grant requests, and that's not the biggest part of the world of foundations in particular, because a lot of grant makers give money to pre-selected organizations. Corporations do the same thing. But we have to at least look at the subset of foundations that would take requests and make sure that we have ourselves out there. Now, does it mean that every proposal we send out is going to get funded? No, it's not. But we have to make ourselves visible. So keep that in mind, because we are going to come back to visibility as an element for turbocharging grant seeking. The other thing is, making sure that whatever we're putting out there on a monthly sustained level is we're asking for sustaining grants, we're asking for investment grants. So You know, it can't be always swinging for the fences and asking for 100,000 and 300,000 and $1 million at a clip. Sometimes it's a mix. You might have some smaller grant proposals going out, $5,000, $2,500. You might have some larger ones that are part of the mix. So I think having a diversified group of grant proposals that you're working with is just a good idea, because some of those grants are easier to win than others. And including leaders and followers. One of the things that I observe in programs that are very competitive when it comes to asking for money from foundations, so basically competitive grant seeking programs, is that they are people who are doing the grant seeking are very cognizant about which foundations or which corporations or which government agencies are really driving philanthropy. So for example, if we're working with a nonprofit organization in a given community, one of the things I'm always trying to find out, like right up front, is which foundations or which corporations are going to give us the good housekeeping seal of approval? Which money do we have to have so that others will feel comfortable in making their investment? So the idea is we are trying to go to leaders, bring those on board. At the same time, maybe we're trying to, you know, build out visibility with some of the smaller funders and bringing those to the table. So it really is a lot of push-pull between small grant proposals, large grant proposals. The main thing is doing it consistently on a month-to-month basis. Number 5, going for grants that make a difference. So it somewhat relates. Yeah, you're going to go for smaller foundation grants, and you definitely should. I mean, if you have a grant maker out there who is a good community funder and can give you $5,000 for a general operating support gift, yeah, I'm going to be the first one to say, sure, absolutely apply for it. But we also find that if you want to grow your portfolio and have more money and get people to think about you differently, you've got to also go for grants that make a difference. But the two major questions that I think I bring to the table in helping clients think through this is, one, if we're going for a large grant, I mean, is this something that's going to help us launch or expand or improve it? In other words, is it going to move us from, you know, level A to level B? Is it going to set the bar higher for other donors? So that means that if we get this money from this particular funder, will others potentially take a look at it and follow with their own generous gifts? And, you know, kind of related to that, the optics of it. I mean, if we get money from a certain foundation, is it going to change how others may think about us? I mean, I've certainly worked with charities who've gotten themselves to that level where they're ready for one of those, you know, mega foundation grants, like a Gates Foundation or a Kellogg Foundation. And I mean, the money is great, but also it's the visibility. I always say that, you know, those big grants can bring, you know, they bring cash to the table, and they also bring cachet to the table. So they help, you know, change the way that people think about you. The other question is, can we meet and manage the expectations of the grant maker? And I think that's an awfully important question, because the funder may check all those boxes in column A over here. Does this grant do all of these things? But if we don't feel like we're going to be able to handle the reporting, or that we're going to meet what this grant maker may likely ask of us, it may not be money that's worth pursuing. I mean, I've certainly had situations where, you know, organizations I've worked with want to go for a certain kind of grant, and maybe from a significant grant maker, and sort of on paper, it looks like it makes sense. But the real question is, okay, if you get this money, can you manage it? Can you report to them? Do you have the bandwidth to do it? I mean, there's a sort of a bit of a running joke in the grant seeking world of, you know, the good news is you got the grant, and the bad news is you got the grant. So the idea is, can you manage it? Is it taking on something that, you know, is not going to be too disruptive? And I think that's a pretty huge question and an important question. Number 6, building your VQ, your visibility quotient. I know this is an odd thing to insert into a conversation about grant seeking, because we don't really think of grants sometimes as a domain where we have to think about PR and image. But to some extent, we kind of do, because promoting our mission, our program, and our accomplishments is the way that sometimes we get onto the radar screen of people who work in foundations. I mean, here is the hard truth and the hard math. The hard truth and the hard math is that there may be like roughly 1.2, 1.3 million nonprofit organizations in the US, and there's about 80,000 grant makers. So how do we stand out? Well, here's something we know about foundations. Most of them are basically, I call them content donors. They are basically funding things that we do. And they're making investments in us because we know our industry, we know our community. So one thing that we want to do in terms of building our visibility is showing that you're a thoughtful and connected leader. This is one of the reasons that in the work that we do with clients, we're constantly talking to CEOs and to the staff and the program staff at different nonprofits about get yourself out there, make yourself known. You can use social media, you can join committees, you can get yourself out of the office and going to conferences and meeting people. The idea is that really you're going for credibility. You're trying to build credibility for your nonprofit organization. And I mean, here's a perspective on it. For grant makers who fund very large, very well-established charities, they expect all of this. They expect to see you in this space. And if you're an emerging and growing charity, this is really where the rubber meets the road in terms of getting yourself to stand out. I mean, grant makers, sometimes will talk almost more about the people they know inside the charity than the charity's mission itself. So VQ, pretty important to pay attention to. And related to that, it's strengthening the network. And there's kind of two networks that one can think about. One is your peer networks. And this means that, if you have the ability to join task forces and committees and get outside of the agency and be part of community conversations, that's pretty important. I think there's a huge part of networking around that helps you build visibility. But here's another byproduct of networking with your peers, and it has to do with research, and it has to do with strategy. Many of us know that Candid, formerly Foundation Center, they have a terrific database, Foundation Directory Online. So you can go into this database and it has information on 80,000 foundations. And that's great. You can find out what these foundations do, what their mission is, who they give money to. But here's what that research usually does tell us. It's that question of what turns the program officer on? What do they really like to fund? What excites them? Kind of goes back to the top of our discussion here, which is aspirational, inspirational. It's good for me to know, like, if I'm going to a certain set of foundations, like, what are they really looking for? That information can likely come to you from your peers. I mean, conversations with people who may be getting money from some of these foundations. I mean, this is human intelligence. So if you're talking to someone who has the direct experience, that is a huge, huge plus in terms of trying to put together a workable strategy. And obviously there's grantor networks. I mean, depending on where you do business and where your community of practice happens to be, if it's sometimes larger metropolitan areas, but even at a state level, sometimes there are peer-to-peer networks of foundations like funder groups, topical funder groups. And if you happen to be funded by one foundation or one corporation as part of one of these groups, they might very well be inclined to help you through introductions to others in that network. So networking is pretty important. So number 8, sharpening the message. I mean, we're still in the business of persuasion here, and we have to think about persuasive writing. But there's a sea change. There's a generational shift in foundation leadership. And right now we're going through really the largest generational shift in foundation leadership that the sector has ever really encountered. I mean, there's a lot of new foundations and a lot of new faces in foundations. And a lot of Gen Xers, a lot of millennials. And how they're thinking about messaging is a bit different than maybe their predecessors. I'm going to give you a quote from one program officer from the Pritzker Foundation in Chicago. And this fellow is in his 20s. And he said, really, when we are looking at grant proposals, we're looking at, the proposal should be less about educating me and more about playing up how you're bringing an entrepreneurial solution to the table. And entrepreneurship for foundations means basically, do you have a real world solution? Have you designed your solution so it works with your community? So they're really looking at the content and the how of what you do. So that's one thing that's kind of changed the conversations that go into grant proposals. We have to probably spend a little less time like building out cases and providing problem statements. Yeah, we talk about our own communities, but they generally know the issues. What they don't know is really how we're planning to go about bringing a solution. And that's really where they want the rubber to meet the road. The ability to demonstrate impact. I mean, this has been a huge change in how foundations are, if you will, evaluating our proposals, evaluating our agencies, identifying grantees. It's those organizations that get results. And results meaning, are you making a difference for the people who participate in your program? Are you changing lives? Are you changing behaviors? And this means that, there is that increasing pressure on nonprofit organizations to come up with ways to evaluate your work. And that means, investing the time and the energy and trying to learn how to do better evaluation. What it means to an end user, storytelling. I mean, this has been one of the most refreshing changes in grant writing that I've experienced in my lifetime, my 30 plus years of doing this, is that we're at a stage in developing grant proposals where we are hearing from grant makers and grant readers, well, tell me about who you're helping. What does it mean to an end user? And I think that's great because it means that we can embed or include in our narrative stories about the people we're helping and how we're making a difference. And I think that's something that grant makers want to feel. I remember hearing a grant maker once, it was actually Abigail Disney, telling a room full of nonprofit executives the following. She said, I don't go where you go, I don't do what you do, and I don't see what you see. You are my eyes, you're my ears, you're my hands. Without you, my money means nothing. So helping that reader understand, how you can make the difference and take their money and enrich a life somewhere is, I think that's something that we all kind of have to think about, and that can kind of come back into the grant writing equation. And then this last point, and I think this is, again, part of the new reality of communication, is basically learn to love haiku. And what we mean by this is we all know that there's an increasing number of grant makers who are having us fill out online application forms. So we have to come in with our robust project description, and we have to get it down to 250 words or less, or 500 characters or less. So the thing is learning how to write succinctly and powerfully. And I'm going to have a couple of resources I'm going to share with you at the end of the slide presentation that I hopefully will be helpful to you. And then finally, we have engagement. So how how are we engaging with these funders that can help us stand out? Well, there's no substitute for direct contact. And what's really interesting is that with next gen leaders coming into foundations, they're used to online contact. They operate in an environment where people tend to reach out and touch someone through email, through social media. So direct contact might be a little bit easier with some of these donors than it was back when we were trying to raise money from a lot of like baby boomers and early Gen Xers who were really running foundations, and basically we were all firewalled at one point because no one answers phones. But now we have the ability, maybe with some increasing frequency, to vet an idea if we're able to do it succinctly. So it goes back to communication. Another way of engaging funders, and I'm seeing this as a method that seems to be working with increasing frequency, is actually bringing funders together and giving them an update or a briefing on your work and you know, what you're doing and why what you're doing is important. This isn't necessarily that you're bringing them into the room and you're giving them a pitch. What you're doing is you're making them smarter about the community where they operate and they have concerns. So you are basically putting yourself out there as an information resource, so a sharer of best practices. Partnering, which is incredibly important because, you know, to the extent that you can develop strategic partnerships with nonprofits, that possibly opens you up to gaining visibility with another whole group of funders. Of course, I mean, your partners are going to be visible with your funders, but this is the thing we have to remember. Foundations give to more than one charity. So even if you're walking the door and you're bringing another nonprofit organization with you, they're going to look at you differently because you're a convener. And therefore, what you're really doing is you're exhibiting thought leadership. You know, you're not only showing it by action and by your strategy, but you're also, you know, demonstrating because you've thought through a problem. You're part of a consortium group. So being part of groups can be extraordinarily helpful. Finally, I want to share with you some tools, 3 things I'd like you to think about, and then we're going to move to questions. So under the category of, you know, tools you can use in terms of turbocharging, again, the point here is trying to get funders to think a bit differently about what you're doing and be inspired to write you bigger checks and make bigger investments. The first sort of category of this I call maps and legends. And basically, can you walk in giving a very broad view of your vision and of your goals? And I mean, I think you're maybe seeing this too, but I am seeing a growing number of funders asking for things like a theory of change or asking for a logic model as part of their application process. Theory of change and logic models, there's lots of really good information and training online that one can get and can help you put all of that together. Strategic planning and program planning. I think that it's really difficult to walk in and ask for very big money unless you have basically the roadmap. You know, how did I get here and where am I going next? And it has to be data informed, and it has to be somehow tied to the mission and tied to the growth trajectory for the organization. So we're expected to walk in with these things. And so investing some time in planning is, I think, absolutely essential if you're going to, again, change conversations and change perceptions about your organization. The sort of second category of tools, and this maybe is not going to be surprising, it's just social media, pure and simple. The reality is that foundations, corporations, and even government granting agencies, well, they're populated by people, and people hang out on social media. So for example, I mean, my personal favorite is LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn. I post to LinkedIn constantly, and that's a great platform for building visibility. And believe it or not, it's great for you to build visibility with program officers and people on foundation boards. As a matter of fact, one of the little pieces of research you should do is when you are planning to apply to a foundation, simply, you know, go to the foundation's website if they have one, and you can look at the staff and see how many of them have LinkedIn profiles. Now, will they connect with you on LinkedIn? Believe it or not, some of them will, some of them won't. But the thing is, you are kind of basically getting their resume, and you're going to have some insight maybe into what makes them tick. And if you are putting up information in that space and they begin to see you being active and get to know you, that's great. This is why I'm always encouraging clients is like, go online to LinkedIn in particular, and post one piece of content every day. It could be something that you write, it's original, put a photograph up of the work you're doing with kids or families, or basically repost a news story. But it shows that you're informed, it shows you're connected, and the main thing is they're going to start seeing your name in feeds. And that can be something that helps to raise visibility for your charity. Because remember, there's a lot of these foundations that give to pre-selected organizations only. They're only going to select you if they know who you are. And then finally, when it comes to communication writing, I want to share with you 3 books, which I always share with my students at Columbia. One of them most of us have or have had at one point in our life. This is the elements of style. I mean, every one of us had a 10th grade English teacher who had us buy this, or language teacher. And the elements of style basically teach us how to write directly and persuasively. The second book is by Kenneth Roman and Joel Rafelson, called Writing That Works. And basically it's about business communication. I always think of it as like Strunk and White, but in the office place. As a matter of fact, look at that on the front cover, the Strunk and White of business writing. And then the third one is a book by Roy Peter Clark called Writing Tools. This is really almost more of a creative writing strategy, but it's basically coming at writing from a creative bent, because remember, we're now being asked to tell stories. We're asked to write persuasively, aspirational, inspirational. And this book is quite good at helping you either think within the box how to do it, but also sometimes pushing you a little bit outside of the box. So I've shared a lot of information and insights here for you. My sort of last word before we go to questions is that basically, I think you all have it in front of you. I think what I've tried to do here is to come at this with with 9 different ideas. The main thing is just knowing that the possibilities are there. They're probably right in front of you. Many of you probably have noticed that the name of my company is DLBHICKS, and I was actually asked 2 days ago, well, who is DLB? And DLB stands for Dylan's Light Bulb, and this is basically Bob Dylan. And Bob Dylan famously walked into a press conference in London back in 1965 carrying a big light bulb, and someone asked him what his message was. Well, Dylan looked at the reporter, and what he said was, keep a good head, always carry a light bulb, which is probably about the best piece of advice I've ever heard along the way. So I think it's all there for us. And with that, I would happily entertain your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Sean. It looks like we do have a few questions here. And just a reminder to everyone again that if you do have a question, you could submit it into the Q&A control panel now, and we'll go ahead and read those aloud to be answered. So the first question that we have, John, is, do you have any tips on how to differentiate your relevance when lots of organizations have similar programs?
Well, I think relevance can start with basically it's like what's outside your front door. I remember hearing a grant maker once say that if you want to write a proposal that's going to engage me and engage my board, don't tell me how you're going to change the world. Tell me how you're going to change your piece of the world. And she said, basically tell me what you see when you go to work every day. Tell me what you experience. Tell me what motivates you to come in to work with people. And telling those kinds of stories and getting at that is going to help you define your relevance. So that's a starting point.
Great. So another question we have is, can you speak a little more on the importance of being financially transparent to the public as an organization and how that might affect your ability to receive grants?
Oh, sure. Well, transparency is super important in terms of the philanthropic sector, but it's doubly, triply important with foundations and with corporations, basically institutional donors, because many of us know that in literally 99% of the cases where you're going to be applying for a grant and you make it to that final grant application process, you're going to have to hand over your financials. I mean, it can be either your IRS 990, it can be an audited financial statement. This is why one of the pieces of homework I think it's really important to do as a grant seeker is understand what are in those financials. I mean, sometimes the financials can tell a challenging story. I mean, will grant makers, for example, fund you if you have debt? Well, yeah, they do. I mean, I think they fund organizations that have debt and have financial challenges. The main thing is what they're looking for is, do you have a solution? I mean, what is your pathway, out of the problems that you have? And I mean, obviously raising money is part of that. So I think, you know, the transparency there is awfully important. And also, just as an aside, conversely, sometimes you can walk into a grant maker and you can have a ton of money. I mean, I've worked with organizations that have very, very large cash reserves or large endowments. And the story we have to make sure that we're prepared to tell is, what does that money mean? And sometimes having those significant reserves can mean the difference, for example, between being able to remain open in an emergency or not remain open during an emergency. I mean, trust me, there's a lot of nonprofits in the healthcare sector right now. If they're sitting on top of very large financial reserves, they're probably thanking their lucky stars that they did it, given where we are right now. So I think understanding the story of your finances is like super, super important, because you will be asked to reveal them.
Great, thank you, John. And so another question that we have right now is, sometimes we'd like to get grants for things that aren't program related, such as building repair or maintenance. Do you have any tips on making those type of grant proposals more appealing to funders?
Yes, thanks for asking that question. When you're asking for money for capital expenses, building maintenance, equipment, repairs, the proposal really shouldn't be about the repair, or it shouldn't be about the maintenance, and it shouldn't be about the equipment. It's what the repairs and the building and the maintenance is going to make possible for people. There's always a people story behind what you do. Just as an aside, I sometimes get asked, like, what's the best grant proposal I ever wrote? And I still come back to it. I wrote a proposal when I was much younger, just starting out in the profession, and I was working on a capital campaign for a YMCA. And basically, we were trying to get money as part of the campaign to pave a parking lot. And if you want to pick probably one of the dullest topics to write a grant proposal about, it's basically paving a parking lot. But the proposal wasn't about paving a parking lot. It's about what the paving of the parking lot was going to make possible. And what it was going to make possible is, if we have more parking spaces, parents who were dropping their kids off at the Y for daycare could park the car and walk the child inside the building. As opposed to, we didn't have enough parking spaces, they had to kind of pull up and drop the kid off. And that's, you know, there's a difference in quality of the interaction. So it was totally about trying to make the consumer experience better for the child and make it better for the parent. And so there were lots of really interesting ways of talking about that from a human perspective. So that's what you want to do. You want to really talk about what those capital expenses are going to make possible for improving the lives of others.
Great answers, John. Thank you for that. That looks like all the questions. Yeah, thanks. That looks like all the questions that we have for now. Just a reminder that in the follow-up email, when we send those slides and recording out, we'll also have both ours and John's information in there. So if you do think of any more questions between now and then, we will have a way that you can submit those to either of us, and we'll make sure we get those answered for you. And now I'll just go ahead and say a few words of conclusion here, and it looks like John's information is on the screen as well. So if you do have any more questions for John, feel free to reach out to him after this webinar with those, and he'd love to get those answered for you. And so now I'll just say a few words at the conclusion. First of all, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you so much, John, as well, for that great presentation. We hope that you will join us for future events and webinars as well. You can find out about those by visiting our website at jmtconsulting.com and clicking on the Events tab. We have our next expert speaker webinar coming up on April 28th, and that will be led by Jessica James. She's going to present over Prospect to Partner, Nurturing Corporate Partnerships. So we'd love for you to join us for that. You can sign up for it on our website at jmtconsulting.com under the Events tab as well. And so that officially concludes our webinar for today. Thank you once again, John, for leading us, and thank you for everyone who joined us today. And so we hope that everyone has a great rest of the day. All right, goodbye, everyone.